Jackie, and this is Kelsey, and we wanted to welcome you to Vermont Law School and to VJEL's Symposium. So right now, in the interest of time, and it's not the bio or the introduction that he deserves, but so that we keep on schedule, we're going to turn it over to Professor Pat Parenteau, who's going to give us a crash course in TMDLs.
Thanks. So if you're all here this early in the morning to listen to me, you really are dummies. So this is TMDL for Dummies, a fast and rapid race through this program that we're going to be talking about all day. And the idea of this session is for those who really haven't had any exposure to the TMDL program, you'll get at least that much. And then perhaps the speakers won't have to repeat every time what it is. So we'll be more efficient as we go. So of course we're talking about the Clean Air, is it the Clean Air Act? I have the Clean Water Act today. And the famous statement of objective to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Well, today we're going to be talking about the restore part of that national objective. And this is the president who gave us the Clean Water Act, of course. Richard Nixon signed more environmental legislation than any president in history, which is a bit surprising. The fellow on the right there is Russell Train, the first administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The fellow on the left is William Ruckelshaus, the second administrator of the EPA and the one who returned to liberate EPA during the Reagan years. The first rule of PowerPoints is do not put a slide up with block text all over it. The second rule, though, is the first rule of statutory construction, which is read the statute. So what we're talking about is section 303D of the Clean Water Act, and you can see on the screen there, we're talking about areas, identification of areas with insufficient controls, maximum daily load, certain effluent limitation revision. Each state shall identify those waters within its boundaries for which the effluent limitations required by those sections. Those are the technology-based effluent limitations and standards that form the bedrock of the Clean Water Act. This title are not stringent enough to implement any water quality standard applicable to such waters. The state shall establish a priority ranking for such waters, taking into account the severity of the pollution and the uses to be made of the waters. That's the bedrock goal of the Clean Water Act, to protect specific uses, which we'll talk about. And each state shall establish for the waters identified, and in accordance with the priority ranking, the total maximum daily load for those pollutants which the administrator identifies this title as suitable for such calculations. So these have to be pollutants that EPA has identified as capable of being quantified for purposes of a TMDL. And there is a published list of such pollutants. Such load shall be established at a level necessary to implement the applicable water quality standards with seasonal variations and a margin of safety. That becomes a major issue in many of the discussions we're going to have today, which takes into account any lack of knowledge concerning the relationship between the effluent limitations and water quality. This goes on, so each state shall submit to the administrator from time to time with the first such submission not later than 180 days from the date of publication of the first identification of pollutants. Well, that occurred way back in 1975, and so there's a story that goes with this statutory command that this program would have begun much earlier than it actually did. We'll talk about that. For its approval, the waters identified and the loads established under that 03D program, the administrator shall either approve or disapprove such identification and load not later than 30 days after the date of submission. This is a duty that rolls forward as more and more waters are designated as impaired and requiring the development of TMDLs. This time clock gets restarted each time, and the administrator is required to act with relative quickness when states submit these lists of impaired waters and proposed TMDLs. Each state shall incorporate them into its current plan. That's the continuing planning process. If the administrator disapproves such identification, he shall not later than 30 days after the date of such disapproval identify such waters in such state and establish such loads. So if the states fail to do this, it's EPA's duty to designate the waters as impaired, and establish TMDLs in the absence of the state doing it. So the statute is set up so that there's not supposed to be gaps and failures in keeping up with designating impaired waters, developing TMDLs, and moving forward with the restoration of those waters.
Professor? I have a question.
Yeah, but not now. So, Section 304 of the Clean Water Act deals with information, and the main thing to remember about this section is this is the source of authority for establishing water quality criteria. These are the specific parameters, things like dissolved oxygen, pH, total organics, temperature, nutrients, concentrations of different metals and contaminants. The water quality criteria documents are the key to developing, to assessing waters for whether or not they're meeting standards and whether or not they're impaired and need to be designated as such. We're currently at the Gold Book Water Quality Standard. There's been several different colors of books for water quality criteria, and that's where we are today. This is another important provision, Section 305. This requires the states to submit their lists of impaired waters every 2 years, assess their waters, and submit these lists. So it's an ongoing obligation to be keeping up with the state of quality of the waters of the states. And so it's a biennial report. And as you can see there, the intent is to protect a balanced population of shellfish, fish, and wildlife and allow recreation in and on the waters of the U.S. So this is the statutory process under which this whole TMDL program fits. This is the larger context. So you start with water quality standards. There are 3 components to water quality standards: designated uses, which the states come up with; the water quality criteria then to support those designated uses and fully support aquatic life criteria and things like that. And then the third component is the anti-degradation policy, which is designed to protect existing uses and to keep clean waters clean. That's the maintain language of that statement of statutory objective we had earlier. And then you go to monitoring and assessing the waters. That's the 305B process. Every 2 years, those reports have to be submitted. When you discover that waters are not meeting water quality standards, they go on to the water quality limited segments list, the impaired waters list there under 303D. Once they're on that list, then that triggers the duty to develop the total maximum daily loads, the TMDLs, to be submitted. The components there are waste load allocations, and the margin of safety. There's another slide coming up to elaborate on that. On the right, you see the relevant regulatory provisions. On the bottom there, you see to the left, there are, of course, two major categories of sources of pollution. One from point sources that are subject to the discharge permit program known as NIPIDs, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. And then on the right, you have non-point, which is everything that isn't point. And that's not subject to regulation. That's a voluntary program. There are incentives and funding provisions for that, but that's largely left to the states, and it's largely, at least from the federal standpoint, a non-regulatory program. And then that bar in the middle is the trading program, about which we're going to hear more later today, which has become more and more important, particularly for purposes of dealing with nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution is one of the chief sources of impairment, of course, throughout the United States. So this is the 303D list of impaired waters. They identify waters not meeting water quality standards after the application of technology-based standards. So the program, the statute is hoping that technology controls, end-of-pipe controls, will deal with pollution to the point where you can achieve water quality standards. But of course the history is that that hasn't been the case. In fact, over 40% of the waters of the United States do not meet water quality standards, largely because of non-point source pollution. And there's also a provision in the statute that requires water quality-based effluent limitations where technology-based limitations are not adequate. That provision has not been used all that broadly across the country. It does exist, and if it's possible to bring waters into compliance with water quality standards through the use of those more stringent water quality-based effluent limitations, that step is supposed to be taken before the waters are designated as impaired and TMDLs are developed. And then, of course, sort of a catch-all, other pollution control requirements that might avoid the impairment. All the listed waters have to have a priority system. There are, as you'll see, there are many more impaired waters than the states and EPA can keep up with. So they do have to set priorities for which waters get attention first. And then they have to identify TMDL schedules at least for 2 years, but there are TMDL schedules stretching out 20 years and more across the country for the number of impaired waters there are. You have to identify the pollutants causing or expected to cause violations of the applicable water quality standards. This is a pollutant-based program, and the reason for that is you're trying to identify point sources of pollutants which you have regulatory control over. And you need to go pollutant by pollutant. Sometimes waters are impaired by more than one pollutant, and TMDL will have to be set for each pollutant that's causing the impairment. Provide documentation to support the determination to list or not to list. This is a quick chart showing you that what I've just said, that non-point source pollution is the primary reason for impairment across the country. We've done a very good job, generally speaking, with regulating point sources, particularly industrial. Of course, we've made a massive federal investment in pollution, publicly owned treatment work, sewage treatment plants. Those plants are in need of upgrade and repair and maintenance, and there's not enough money to do everything that needs to be done, but there's at least a lot, in fact, a lot of people say the biggest single benefit of the Clean Water Act was the huge investment in cleaning up sewage pollution across the country, and so now we're dealing with the bigger and tougher problem of non-point source. So where is this water body, do you think? New Jersey? Louisiana? Texas? It does look like Lake Champlain, doesn't it? Hard to believe, huh? But these folks are going to take care of it all. So some of these folks you can recognize in here. I know there's a, this is Kurt Spalding, the regional administrator for Region 1 of EPA. This fellow here is the outgoing governor of Vermont, you may recognize. This is Secretary Chuck Ross of the Agency of Agriculture, former state director for Senator Leahy for many years. He'll be here today. This is Deb Markowitz, Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources. She'll be here today. And then, I'm not sure who this character is, but I've seen his face on a post office wall. I think that's David Mears. How about this one? Chesapeake. How about this one? That's the mouth of our river, the Connecticut River. So when we poop in South Royalton, that's where it goes. So that's Long Island Sound. That's what happens when you put too much nutrients in a water body, suck out all the oxygen, and the fish can't breathe. That's Long Island Sound after a particularly severe hypoxic event. You've all heard about the dead zone. You're going to hear a lot more about that today, too, with some of the panels that we're going to be talking about. What is a TMDL? The greatest amount of loading that a water can receive without violating water quality standards. That's what we call a loading capacity. You can think of it as a cap if you want, like other kinds of caps we know about. So it's the waste load allocation, the load allocation, the margin of safety added up. Waste load allocation, sum of waste load allocations for existing and future point sources on your water body. Some load allocation, sum of load allocations for existing and future non-point and background sources. That's a huge problem. Lake Champlain, Chesapeake Bay, and other places, the legacy effect of the buildup of phosphorus and nitrogen over many, many years, stays in the soil, bleeds out into the water, takes a long time to attenuate. So that's a critical calculation in the TMDL calculation. Margin of safety is for the unknowns, and so that varies depending upon, of course, how much you don't know and how conservative you want to be in your estimates of what needs to be removed in order to achieve water quality standards. You can think of it as a pollution budget. A simple illustration is those would be your point sources, and you set a waste load allocation for the point sources. Those would be the non-point. You set the load allocation for the non-point. You have a reserve capacity for future development, and then you have the margin of safety for the things that you don't know. You can think about this in your own life as, you know, what would your budget look like? You'd have the mortgage, the car payments, water and electricity, groceries and other essentials, contingencies and savings accounts. What's missing from there? Oh yeah, law student debt. So that would be in there too. So when you look at a watershed and you're looking at it from the standpoint of what are your sources of pollution, uh-oh, it's not working. So you can look at farms. Now farms can either be point or non-point depending on whether they're concentrated animal feeding operations or something other than that. You can look at your sewage treatment plants in your watershed. You can look at specific facilities, whether they be recreational, hotels, facilities, power plants, because airborne deposition of nitrogen and other pollutants are also a major cause of impairment in water bodies. You can certainly look at construction activities which disturb soil. Then you've got your marinas down here that you also have to think about. I'll go as fast as I can. So this is what the TMDL program today looks like, 71,000 impaired waters. That's a lot of work to do and a lot of money to spend on this process. These are the top listed impairments: pathogens, metals, nutrients, organic enrichment, low DO, sediment, PCBs, a lot of sediment contamination in rivers, industrial areas of the country, huge problem, mercury, pH impairments, more and more a problem with coastal waters and ocean acidification, impaired biota, turbidity. Those are some of the waters around the country where there are particularly concentrated segments that are impaired. Point sources, you got discharge effluents through discrete conveyances, pipes, and man-made ditches. You can control those with NPDES permits, things like treatment plants, power plants, concentrated animal feeding operations, ditches, and sediment barriers for construction activities through the stormwater control program. Racing along here, you've got non-point sources, diffuse pollution sources without a single point of origin, or not introduced into a receiving stream from a specific outlet, generally carried by rain, not permitted under the NPDES program, cropland, forested land, acid mine drainage, cows in streams, which we can see up the road here, lots of geese concentrating in various places, and so forth. This is a very important concept. It's not in the law, it's not in the regs, it's in EPA's guidance, but it's nevertheless a very important concept. You'll hear a lot more about this on the panel discussing the Chesapeake Bay Third Circuit decision, but it basically requires that where you have a mixture of point and non-point sources in your TMDL, you have to provide assurances that the non-point sources will actually be addressed. Remember, that's a voluntary program that requires a lot of money, so this is a tricky calculation of how you determine whether those cleanups of the non-point sources will actually occur. Should be case-specific and utilize adaptive management. TMDL implementation through the non-point source program, no federal regulatory program exists. It's all basically focused on state and local. The Farm Bill has a lot to do with non-point source and provides funding for cleaning up agricultural sources of pollution. Point sources, we've talked about the permits. This is what you do with waste load allocations. The permit writers have to translate those into these water quality-based effluent limitations, which I mentioned. Those go right into the permit. They become federally enforceable by citizen suits. So there's a whole regulatory apparatus around waste load allocations and water quality-based effluent limits. And there's some more information about how the QBELs are developed. I think we'll probably be hearing more about that as the day goes on. As I mentioned, water quality trading from EPA's standpoint has become almost a policy of choice, an instrument of choice, particularly in dealing with nutrients. And it's controversial. It's still, in large ways, experimental, particularly the point to non-point source trading that's going on. But this is EPA's sort of short-form version of what a successful or even an approvable water quality trading regime has to have. It has to be transparent, real, accountable, defensible, enforceable. Those are the sort of take-home messages you could think about trading. I think we'll hear some more about that later today. For trading to work, you obviously have to have demand, you have to have a market driver, you need a TMDL, you need a cap, just like cap and trade with air pollution, like SO2 and now with carbon. You need something that drives a trading market. You need a cost differential to make it worthwhile for one entity to pay another entity to do things that are more cost effective to reduce the pollutant of concern. So there has to be a significant cost differential because there are transaction costs associated with these trades. You've got to have the ability and the opportunity and lots of other things. The case law, real fast at the end. The case that got the whole TMDL program off the dime because it went for 17 years with no TMDLs having been set at all, despite that language I showed you at first that they were supposed to start within 180 days of the publication of EPA's list in 1975. It took until this case to actually finally break the deadlock and get the TMDL program started through an interesting theory called constructive submission we don't have time to discuss. Another key case is Pronsolino versus Nastri. This answered the question, what if the impairment is solely caused by non-point, not point? The answer is yes, it still has to be listed as impaired and the TMDL still has to be developed. This case made the point that neither the Act nor EPA rules require that TMDLs actually contain an implementation plan. Might seem kind of surprising to you, but that's the law. So that's up to the states to come up with the implementation plans. EPA has leverage, EPA has money, EPA has ways of moving that process forward, but it's largely a state initiative. Friends of the Earth versus EPA answered the question, does daily mean daily in total maximum daily load? The answer is yes, it does. That's in contrast to a Second Circuit decision which went the other way, but EPA opted to follow the Friends of the Earth case and establish daily loads. And then a couple of other cases, watershed TMDLs must be established at a level to achieve water quality standards for each impaired reach. The Levitt case, state does not need to list waters meeting water quality criteria because of natural conditions. That introduces a lot of controversy over whether something is entirely natural or human caused. And then, of course, the case that we're going to be following up on today, which led to the revised TMDL for Lake Champlain Conservation Foundation versus EPA, which was a settlement agreement. And because you've all been, and then Virginia Department of Transportation, an interesting case that says you can't use flow as a surrogate for pollutants in stormwater. Not a very scientific outcome in this case. The science says that flow is a really good surrogate, actually, and a better way to manage stormwater with nutrients and sediments in it, but the court said the statute doesn't permit that in this particular case. Emerging issues, regular stormwater, nutrient criteria, climate change, PCBs, invasive species, ocean acidification, water quality trading, TMDL revisions, and thank you very much.